And Molly, you need to give me your,
I'm doing
Okay.
it currently, thanks.
all right, welcome back, folks. Thought it would be good for us to use the next 20 minutes or so just to share with each of the subgroups from this morning what we are running for scenarios with the actuaries. Yeah. Great. Who wants to lead off here? Everybody jump. Okay, Mike.
So I'm just going to make sure I'm on the right spot. So we started with looking at sort of a combination of items. I guess I'd bucket them into four categories. One, looking at the amount of contributions. One, looking at the way the COLA is structured, use of one-time money, and then use of ongoing money. So on the contribution category for both VSTRs and VSERs, we're thinking of sort of three-tiered thresholds. One where you had basically the bottom quartile of salary earners or wage earners. So anyone, that's sort of 0 to 25%, whatever that is on the bottom quarter of wage earners, they would remain the same in both of those scenarios. So whatever that is for the different plans. And then for those in that sort of 26 or 25% to 75, 74%, a 1.5% increase, and then also looking at a 2% increase. And then for those in the 75 top quartile, looking at a 2% increase and then a 2.5% increase. And again, that would be sort of a progressive construct where your first, 25, your first sort of whatever those translate into in terms of dollar amounts, that threshold up to that amount of money you would pay the 6 point whatever if you're a state employee, and then you would pay the higher amount on the amounts earned above that, and then phasing that in at sort of a 0.5% per year. So it wouldn't be a one-time impact. It'd be an impact, gradually implemented. On the COLA, we looked at applying a COLA only to the first $24,000 of pension income. And then under that, we talked about looking at keeping the $24,000 fixed over time, so that number would not adjust, but then also looking at adjusting that $24,000 number annually by CPI. So that $24,000 number would grow with inflation over time. And then also amending the CPI thresholds from where they are now to 0 to 4%. We had, I guess, two open questions. I'm not sure we really landed on these, but would we exempt anyone from this COLA, change, whether you're 5 years of retirement or some other sort of construct? And then would you also look at delaying the COLA for everybody, not just for the 12 months, but for 24 months and 36 months? So that was contributions in COLA in connection with that, using the one-time money and basically looking at splitting it 50-50, so 75 million, looking at another scenario where it was 50 million, and that was just so that the other 50 million might be used for some other purpose. So just getting a sense of what that might mean if you run those two different one-time money amounts. And then looking at ongoing money, similar to what the treasurer had looked at, 40 million for each system in terms of new money, and then $15 million for each system in terms of new money. So that was sort of the package. I think you can put together a couple of different scenarios out of that one sort of large scenario that we came up with. But that was sort of the approach. We talked about incentives beyond retirement age that we talked about. We talked a little bit, but did not advance the conversation much about new plans for new employees. And then we also talked about correcting workers and looking at a couple of different scenarios there, looking at sort of the employees in Group F who are specifically carved out as having sort of frontline, facing jobs, and what it would mean if those employees receive the same benefits as the new Group C that I think we have been discussing. And then what would the financial impact of that be if we did that? And then if you tried to keep that sort of actuarially neutral, so that you didn't have a negative actuarial impact, what would the contribution amount need to be for those group F carved off employees. And then look at that same scenario, but instead of all group F, it was just correction carved off employees. And similarly, looking at what if they receive the benefits in new group C, what's the financial impact, and then what would their contribution amounts need to be to make it have no negative actuarial impact. So I think those were sort of all of the things we kind of talked about and wanted to explore more with the actuary. Like I said, we don't have one scenario. We kind of have to, there's kind of a few tweaks within those different levers, but I think we got to a pretty good road of some things that we could sketch out with the actuary.
Oh, Chris took your notes? Oh, really?
Anybody else would like to translate?
Really, boy.
We've got a pretty good idea.
Yeah, I think Andrew and I have now. Go for it, Chris.
All right, so I have to start this with the caveat that since I'm not a task force member, I'm a JFO staffer. I am just translating what group expressed interest in looking at. I'm not making a recommendation on behalf of JFO. So the teacher group looked at some similar themes to what Commissioner Pichak just described on the state employee side. So there were several different options that folks expressed interest in taking a look at. So in addition to the early retirement or the incentives to encourage people to work longer, the two ideas that were expressed were increasing the AFC cap by 1% for each year you work beyond your 33.4 years of service, roughly. So if you worked 34 years of service, that would go from 60% of AFC to 61%, so on and so forth. With no carve out for any of the existing actives and no changes to be made for current retirees. Other option was to take a look at a freezing option where if you reach the rule of 90 or age 65, whichever first, you have the option to enter into a freeze program where you essentially freeze your benefit at that time. You can continue to work a few years, but not incur any additional pension liability from those years. You also would not be making any more contributions into the system, and that 5 or 6% or whatever the rate is that you're currently paying, you could either keep in your check or go to a deferred comp type of plan, so you can have further tax advantage retirement savings. And you did a great job summarizing that earlier, but it's on the paper for us to look at.
Chris, can I ask a question about that? Would the employee wouldn't pay into for those additional years? Would the employer continue to pay in the matching amount?
So that's an open question that we did not get into.
Okay.
But if the employee would not, it would advantage the system if the employer continues to just pay a flat percentage of payroll for the whole payroll, but it obviously, the system would not be incurring future liabilities because
Right.
the members
Yep.
not getting extra service credits for that
Yep.
freeze period.
Just curious.
But no, we did not go into that. There were some ideas to take a look at one-time revenues, recurring revenues, the COLA, and employee contribution rates. So I'm just going to run through the options individually, and then I'll go through the sort of scenarios that folks express interest in looking at combined. So I call this contribution option 1, where folks who are currently paying 5% contributions would increase in 0.25% increments a year for 4 years, beginning in FY23. So by FY26, folks would be paying 6% instead of 5%. The folks who are currently paying 6% would have their contributions increased by 0.25 point a year for 2 years, beginning in FY25. So by FY26, the older group who's currently paying 5 would be paying 6. And the newer group who's currently paying 6 would be paying 6.5. The second contribution option took a look at a progressive structure based on your income. So for folks who are actively working, the contribution rate would be 5.5% on their first $40,000 of income, 6.25% on $40,001 up to $60,000, 7% from $60,001 to $80,000, and 7.75% on income above $80,000. Folks also expressed interest in taking that and looking at what that translates to effective contribution rates for a member who is earning $60,000, $80,000, or $100,000 a year. So those are the two employee contribution options that folks expressed interest in taking a look at. The COLA options, there were three ideas put forth. COLA idea one is to set the threshold at $48,000 and basically maintain status quo in how the COLA is calculated. So that's 50% of CPI for the teacher group C. And then if you're over $48,000, or the amount of your retirement benefit over $48,000, the CPI would be 25% of CPI instead of 50% of CPI, which it currently is. COLA option two would be to have sort of a similar tiered progressive structure where the more COLA you earn based on the lower amount of money you get in retirement would be subject to a higher COLA. So for benefits up to the first $20,000 have a 100% CPI COLA. That is an increase over the current 50% of CPI. But then for people whose retirement benefits are between 20 and 40,000, that would be adjusted by 50% of the CPI. Benefits over $40,000 would be adjusted by 25% of the CPI. And these income tiers that 20 are not proposed to be indexed to inflation over time. But over time, through employee experience, more and more people's benefits over time will fall underneath that threshold. COLA option three was to take a look at what would happen if not all members were entitled to a COLA, but have a member accrue at least 15 years of service credit in order to vest in a COLA benefit. So if you were to accrue 5 years of service and vest in the plan, you would get your retirement benefit. And it would not be adjusted for CPI, but you would have to accrue 15 years of service to begin accruing that retirement benefit. That 15-year is similar to the thresholds to qualify for the OPEB benefits. So scenario one took a look at, so those are the plan design options that folks were interested in looking at. Folks were also interested in looking at one-time and recurring revenue. So scenario one proposed to look at $97.5 million in one-time revenue. So that would be 65% of the $150 million that's in reserve. $32.5 million of recurring revenue. COLA option one, which is that $48,000 threshold. Taking a look at the freeze and the 1% FSC cap once you hit your maximums levers, and also looking at the incremental phased in contribution increases in scenario one, where folks who are currently paying 5 go up to 6.25% increments a year over 4 years. Folks currently paying 6 would go up to 6.5 and quarter-point increments over 2 years.
Is the 97.5 in one time
Correct.
in addition to the 150?
I believe that is 97.5 of the 150.
It's like 65% of the
Right.
150.
Oh, so it isn't in addition to the 150, it's part of the 150.
We were assuming a little more than half because of the underfunding.
Okay. And not specifying where the other 35% would go.
To the V-Serves, right?
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Assume 65-35
Okay,
split.
of the 150.
Part of the discussion was these thirds is about 2/3 of the problem right now.
Actually works out exactly to be 65-35 in terms of the shares of their overall
Yeah.
unfunded
No, I just wondered
liabilities.
if
Yeah.
it was in addition or if it was part of.
And I think it matched up with what was run before that 65-35 split.
So that was scenario one. Scenario two is largely similar, but we just swapped out different options in the mix. So still 97.5 million of one time, 50 million of recurring instead of 32.5 of recurring. The same two incentive options that we discussed. COLA option two, which was the creating thresholds at $20,000 and $40,000. So retirement benefits up to the first 20,000 get 100% of CPI. Benefits between 20 and 40,000 get 50% of the CPI. It's over 40,000 get 25% of the CPI. And sorry.
So if I may, regarding the recurring one, the first option was 32 million, 50 million. Is that above the ADEC recommendation?
I believe so, yes.
And is that just for the boosters?
Yes.
Fine.
For the teachers.
Yeah. Okay,
And the other revenue would be going to B-Cers.
what other revenue?
So if it was 32.5, I believe it said that they're looking at 50 million of new revenue. So that other part of the 50 million, 18 or 17.5 going to B-Cers.
Okay, so you're.
Our numbers were 65% of the overall number. We're
And
looking at
you-
a 65-35 split, but we didn't put down the overall number. We just put down the 65% of that number.
And how did you come up with 50?
The 50 million was, again, it's about a 65-35 split. It would be 75 million revenue like we had the actuaries run. So 50 going to B-Cers, 25 going to B-Cers.
No, maybe I misunderstood. Oops. The recurring is 32.5 boosters.
Yeah.
Which is 65% of 50.
Yeah.
And how did you come up with 50?
We just chose it.
You just chose it. Okay, that was the question.
Gotcha.
Trying to
Yeah.
get something on the board.
Yeah, no, I get that. I just wasn't sure where, yeah, okay.
And then the scenario two, the last thing that distinguishes that is the one that includes taking a look at the progressive tiered contribution rate, where people would pay 5.5% on their first 40,000 of income, 6.25 between 40 and 60,000, 7 on income between 60 and 80, 7.75 on income above 80. The last scenario, scenario three, is just like the first scenario. The only real difference is instead of doing the COLA threshold at $48,000, the COLA would maintain the same current CPI structure that's currently in place, only it would have that 15-year vesting requirement. So one would have to work and accrue 15 years of service to be vested and entitled to a COLA when they retire on their retirement benefit. Are there any questions?
Well, I guess the only question I have now is with the different options that were able to B-Cers and B-Cers for the actuary to do this work. I have no concept of, is this more that they're capable of doing in the time frame we need it done or not?
It's a great question. I would look to Will to color in the lines. I don't think a lot of this analysis is, especially when you're looking at contribution rates, isn't overly complicated if they have the data set of the payroll distribution. I think what the hardest thing for them to do, and we obviously have a pretty good sense of what the additional revenue scenarios look like. It's just a matter of sort of putting that into the mix, just so we have like a picture on one slide. I think where you get into complications are, it's really hard for them to predict if you're giving options to people, what the uptick rate is going to be on those options. So there can be some known unknowns in that realm. And I think we've said pretty repeatedly that this is their busy season right now. They're doing the actuarial valuations for the different systems. That work does take precedence. So this will take some time for them to do a first pass at. I don't expect we would really have anything given the other demands on their workload till probably end of next month. But and we'll keep me honest here, but I also think that once you've got some models kind of loaded into the system, you want to make a rather minor change to that. It's not going to take another month to make that change.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. I will say, I mean, as you know quite well, Representative, they get evaluations done and the boards need to review them so that we can have the ADEC proposed by the end of the next month. So that's kind of a hard deadline. That being said, I agree with Chris, the things that they've already modeled, whether just tweaks in the numbers or small changes, should be pretty easy to do. As you get further away from that, it becomes more complex. And ultimately, I can't know what their volume is, so we would have to ask them, they have to tell.
So we can take another moment for folks to ask questions about any of these scenarios or make any statements that they want to. I think just in terms of warming up for our last agenda item today, which is to talk about next week's agenda. It occurs to me that we may want to take a week off in October so that we have an extra meeting to come back to after we have this information. And so when these scenarios are delivered to the actuary, will they be able to say, hey, it's definitely not going to be, it's definitely going to be 4 weeks more, or hey, I think we can turn this around more quickly?
So I think so. So typically the process is that Chris will send an email to me dictating what the assumptions are in the scenarios. I'll take a look at it to see if there's anything that's unclear. And then we send it to the actuaries and usually come back with some questions. But as part of that, them having a look at it and the answers to the questions being answered, they should be able to give us a rough estimate of timeline.
Great, thank you.
I have a question for Mike. Can you say the part regarding recurring funds? Can you say what numbers you were talking about running again?
Yeah, for
On your
sure.
I think you had two scenarios.
One was 30 million split evenly, the other was 80 million split evenly.
And we chose 80 because the treasurer had already done that one. So, I mean, he's done that already.
Sarah, I was just wondering, were you suggesting that one of the scheduled meetings in October we don't have? Okay. And we're not meeting next week.
That is correct. And I'm just saying that because I suspect after we get this information back from the actuary, we'll want to turn around and refine some of these and do another round. And so it might be nice for us to save an extra meeting to stack up at the end so that we can figure out what to do with the information we have.
Which date were you suggesting we wouldn't have? Is that,
I haven't
okay,
suggested a date.
okay, I've already put in all.
So you would then potentially do, but there might be a week where we have two meetings. I don't know that there's another week that we are not. I think it's just maybe the Thanksgiving week we're not doing it.
Right, we don't have a meeting scheduled that week.
And if doubling up meeting has too many complications to it, we might be able to ask the speaker and the pro tem to allow us to meet beyond December 1st if we need that time.
I just want to report out the trooper
Yeah,
scenarios. So we had two options for contributions. The first one is Dan believes the second one. And then the first one is a contribution increase of 1.35%. That would be phased in over a couple of years. And so I just ran some numbers. If we did it over 3 years, there's a 0.27% increase in those 3 years. And if we did it over 5 years, it would be 0.45%. So we might want to choose one of those two options.
I think those are inverted.
I think those are
Oh,
reversed.
sorry.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we're still awake.
Thank you.
It was a test.
Yeah,
One of the questions we had is, could that 1.35% be solely directed to unfunded liability instead of a normal cost?
Yes. So one of the things we talked about was that normally when employee contributions increase, employer contributions go down. So that usually goes towards the normal cost. And so in order to do it this way, you'd have to come up with a way in which this additional contribution would be on top of any contributions from the employer. So help aside, kind of like the revenue.
Sure, whatever.
So that was the first contribution option. The second one is similar to the state employees option of dividing contribution increases by quartile. The real distinction between what the state employees are doing and Group C would be, we want to look at what are the appropriate quartiles for Group C employees, with the assumption that we probably believe that they are at a higher rate of pay for the most part, because they're all certified law enforcement officers. So that would be the only significant change between what was proposed for the state employees. So that's with respect to contributions. Now, with respect to early retirement, one of the things that's unique with respect to Group C is there is either no incentive to work until age 55 or there's no disincentive to retire at 50. So what we worked on, and it's something the treasurer also modeled, is that after 50, there would be either a 1% or 2%, and we both of those modeled, increase each year, so that there would be an incentive for working longer. The other thing that changes the normal retirement age from 55 to 57. Obviously, in this scenario, no one is going to be required to actually work to 57. They can retire when they're 20. I mean, at 50 with 20 years of service, 51 or 54, but they could choose to work until age 57. Then we looked at the COLA, and we wanted to tie that to the assumed rate of return, so that if the assumed rate of, if the rate of return met the assumed rate of return or exceeded it, they would get the existing COLA benefit. If the rate of return was less than the assumed rate of return, they get 1%, which is the minimum COLA. And we also talked about revenue, and we would like to see more one-time revenue thrown at this problem beyond the $150 million that has been already allocated to this problem. We also talked about recurring revenue, and I'm going to speak more for myself than Dan, because I was the one voicing concern about this more than he was. Is that I'm very concerned that the chances of recurring revenue being a solution here is it's not politically feasible, given the actors that have to sign off on this legislation. So I just think that that's just not feasible. So I think rather than focus on that, focusing on one-time revenue would be a better option. One that could get through the legislative process and get signed by the government.
Ask a question about that.
Sure.
So on how, I know that the three systems are different, and that the contribution rates and everything is different with the three systems, but I just, when you said that on the COLA, if the assumptions were met, the rate of return assumption was met, then they get the regular COLA.
Right.
Otherwise, it would be 1%. And I just wondered how, because one of the things that we recommended was changing from the 1 to the 5 to a 0 to 4. If we did that for state employees, do we have to do that same?
No, because Dan and I were solely focused on Group C.
Yeah, I know that.
And Group C's benefits are different than Group F's.
Yeah, I know that.
So I think it would be, you could have different.
Different floors and ceilings for
Different
the,
COLAs for
okay.
both of those.
okay,
And then, I mean, we just focused on, that's what we came up with.
Yes.
It's already different.
Yeah, it is.
okay,
The COLA assumptions for Group C and Group F are already.
okay, all right, I just wondered. I wasn't sure. Okay.
So I guess my next question is, now that we have these ideas discussed, what are our next steps with them, knowing that it's the busy season for the actuary, and that we're not meeting next week? Where do we stand?
We said, Chris sends an email with all of those to Will, and Will send, or to your office. And he sends them off to I think you said you're gonna ask some questions, you're gonna get some clarification.
Yeah, I mean, because
And then-
I said that's a typical
Yeah.
process. Usually
Right.
I'm not here, so.
Yeah, and then send them off to the actuary.
Great.
And if I may, Representative Gannon and Commissioner Pichek just got emails from me. So at your convenience, if you wouldn't mind sending me your notes, just make sure I captured everything accurately. My goal is to put everything in one combined, simple chart to send over to Will this week, or the weekend, so we can advance this conversation.
And if you could send that to everybody on when you get that put together, so that everybody sees the same thing.
If there are follow-up questions that come through our process that we didn't think to ask in our small groups, I will circle back with the appropriate folks to get clarity. I don't want to make any assumptions or the words are good.
So the one thing I'm thinking of is I heard a couple incentives and things like that maybe didn't have behavioral assumptions associated with them. So I'm not sure what you'd like the actors to do. They can't really make a guess on who's going to take these things. If you want to give some direction on that, that would probably make the process easier.
Would it make sense? Sorry.
So I'll say this, we did regarding the additional funds or the additional percentages that were added if you stayed beyond your retirement date. The behavioral piece that we put to that was that 50% of folks retired. And then it would be 10% a year for the next 5 years. Thus, you'd have 100% of the people retired at that time. And it is the same across both, just to make it easy for us. Yeah, look at the same thing. In other words, no behavioral bias in that.
Can we just then make that consistent for all the incentives that are listed out there?
That piece is apples to apples.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Do we, this is a question for all of us or none of us, I'm not sure. Do we have to also run some scenarios for group D to get to the actuaries? We haven't talked about that. We haven't talked to anybody from group D, but we are supposed to come up with some suggestions for group D and then run it by the judiciary, which I assume means Judge Pearson and yeah, Dan.
I was going to suggest maybe we put that on the agenda for getting someone from Group D at least reaching out to them to hear from them, and then that would at least help us make a decision about some of the things that we want to send up. So I was going to add that to the agenda when we talked about it.
Okay, good.
So,
Thank you.
The only thing I suggest about that is they probably need to be educated about what we've been working on for the last couple of months before they testify, so that they have some idea of what we're looking at. So, we need to think about whether we'll have enough time for our next meeting. Because if we want to get a proposal from them, I think they need to understand some of the work that we've done and some of the ideas that we're looking for the other groups in the future. Or they won't know where to start. I mean.
Yeah, and I definitely understand the need to get input from the affected parties at a stage in the process. I think we've discussed what contributions increases would look like across groups, and I certainly don't wouldn't hurt to at least take a look at that for Group D as we start the actuarial process going.
Are you suggesting, Eric, that we just propose something for Group D to the actuaries, and then when that comes back, then get the feedback from,
Yeah, I'm thinking about that as a starting point. I have not looked back at what has been run for Group D. I'll say that. You know, I was focusing on Group F today. But I don't think it would hurt to get the ball rolling on what some of the items we've discussed might look like for Group D.
That's what I mean, we have not run any, we being like, what I've seen, I have not seen a actuarial analysis yet. We're also dealing with a relatively small cohort of members, both active and retired. So you have an extremely small cohort relative to the overall members of the system. So I don't expect these changes will move the needle many millions of dollars. Your point is very valid that we should probably perhaps engage that and have similar process. They come up with some ideas.
Yeah. So how are we gonna get them up to speed? We're just gonna send Pat Gable and Judge Pearson some information?
Well, no, I think,
I don't-
you know, Gable could meet with the fiscal office.
Yeah.
And
Okay,
just fiscal to, you know, walk them through what we've been through, yeah, some of the things, the scenarios that we've been discussing.
Okay.
And, you know, what we just arrived at today, so they have an idea of. what
Where
we
we're
come up
going.
with.
good.
So they'll know what to look at, and they'll know
Yep.
contributions, coalitions, things like that. So they'll be in a much better position to provide some sort of proposal.
Oh, yeah, yeah, I just
We're
don't,
happy to do that.
yeah, good. I just don't want them to come in here and us to have to,
No,
Go
and that's
through
why I
all
was
the-
suggesting
yeah.
that they
Chris.
need to be brought up to speed before.
We're both happy.
good. Thank you. Okay. All right. Yeah, there are 52 active people in it right now. That's it. Okay, so are we at the point of looking at the agenda for the next meeting? We have had some suggestions. But of course, in my fog, I didn't write them down. What is the
One item I wanted to iron out was NC PERS is willing to testify. I think we had put them on the agenda last meeting for 1 PM. I was asked if that could be 11 AM. So I hope we can accommodate that request.
We probably can.
I said I thought we could, but I would confirm.
So one of the things that we do have to do is start, we are supposed to have by the 13th, an interim report, a progress report. So I think we need to start looking somewhat at what we're gonna put into the progress report.
I think that would be a large chunk of time. Because we have 2 meetings before the progress report, the 6th and the 13th, and then it's due the 15th. So
Yeah, and I think that a lot of how we organize that is that what makes sense to me is that we kind of come up with a table of contents of what we want in the report, and a lot of it is already generated and here. So I think that our ledge council people are very good at coming up with reports if we tell them what we want in it. Is that the way you looked at that, Sarah? Yeah, Molly?
Does that exist anywhere we could review it? I know we talked about it maybe a month ago at 2 meetings. but I feel like I haven't read it in a while, the pieces that we have so far.
Well,
You're talking about the document that starts with the principles?
Well, that's one part of, that's,
Yeah.
in the interim, in the progress report, we're gonna have a lot more than that.
Right, and like Chris has been adding some things and Dave has been adding things, right? So is there a way, can we have access to read those prior to?
Sure. And then we need to be thinking of what else goes into there. Like,
Right.
are all these options that we've been putting out, do we want to put those
Uh-huh.
in there? Do we want to talk a little bit about our process and how we've been doing this and how we, so, yeah, I think that is on, is one of the documents that we have. I
Not
don't
with
think
the
there've been any
though, right?
changes since then.
No, we've been adding some. back and stuff like that. You know, like, who's on the task force? When was the scheduled meeting? So I don't think we have something in shape this year just yet, because I know I'm still adding some things that have been requested by this group, but ideally over the next 2 days.
Okay.
I'm still working on the block.
I gave you a pretty good start.
You did, thank you.
Since we don't meet next week, could we all, if we have a draft of this, could we all review it next week? And then the following week, when we do meet, we can make any changes? Does that make sense?
And if somebody thinks of something that should be in the report that has not, is not in the table of contents or it hasn't been considered, then we should discuss that and figure out how we get it in.
I'm sorry. I just had a thought of something that came back to me. I think one of the things that we were also going to ask Nazara about was for them to explain more information about the layered approach, which I believe is our first bullet point. I think that was the second thing we wanted from Nazara, was more information about that.
Layered for the amortization.
Yeah, I don't have that document with the options on there. I can't remember what the exact wording is on there, but I think that was the other piece of it. And for them to present information, because there was some general interest when we were first going through that options document on that. And I think many of the comments were, we need more information about this.
So they provided a link. In the document for some, the amortization. So take a look at that first before I ask.
What did you say that that it was, or the date?
They sent the, we all got the, I think we all got the email.
And
They put that link in there.
Okay,
They put a link on amortization. In the document they sent.
great,
Following up on all the questions that people have.
great.
So following up on that, is that something we're gonna want the actuary to look at? Will they? And, you know, we've had some discussion around 2% growth rate too. Just trying to think, the earlier we get started on some of these requests, the better.
John, is that something the actuary would be looking at? Or is that,
I mean,
I don't know.
If I may, the layered amortization approach assumes that there's going to be accident situations that will occur along the path of the amortization schedule that would throw a normal amortization schedule out of kilter, either to the good or to the bad. And instead of re-amortizing any further, the amortization schedule continues on as planned, and you just add a new amortization schedule for just that one accident event on top of it.
Right.
So layering multiple layers of amortization schedule. Because the actuary wouldn't have any knowledge of something that might happen in 2030. I don't know if there's anything to model.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had the
Yeah.
same question on that.
Let me agree with Representative Fagan. I think the one area where we could ask them to model, and it's a fairly straightforward one, is if there's interest in moving from the current structure where your future amortization payment is around 3% increments, to change that to some other factor. They could show what that looks like. You know, if you reduce that growth rate, it will, when all else is equal, it will increase their ADAC in the short term. But it's something they could model relatively easily. We just need to tell them what to model.
Would we want them, something to consider is two options, a 2% growth schedule within the current 2038 period, and an alternative being starting with the current ADEC and modeling 2% to whatever year that completes in.
So we are not allowed under Act 75 to propose extending the amortization period beyond.
I thought that couldn't be accounted for in targets, but that was under memory here.
No, you're right.
If it's a fairly easy thing to come up with, you know, to look at the growth of the ADAC, if we drop the percentage there from 3 to 2, why not?
And that would just be to clarify, that would be the amortization payment of the ADAC, not the full. That's the still.
So, you know, now that we present a slide on payroll growth, experience with producers and boosters. So if we're going to do this, I think there has to be two different amortization schedules for research and boosters, because looking at the data they provided, there's a significant difference in the payroll growth between research and boosters.
There's also the option you will have, you don't necessarily have to recommend any change to study. You don't have to study every option, but make a recommendation that should there be unusual growth later in the amortization period, that the state should explore a way.
So where are we?
Well, I think we can work something out through actual. But as Peter said, I mean, you know, with respect to having the multi-amortization schedules, the exigent circumstances are responsible for the second one is very hard to model. Because we don't know what they are. We don't know when they're about. So that I don't think we can, but I think it's a good idea. It's just, you know, we're not going to be able to show a number. For the impact. With respect to the other thing, though, you know, change the amortization schedule from 3% payroll, that we can have the actual. So I think that the only issue is coming up with what we want them to see. And I think we can work on two different proposals, one for the future. But there are different. The payroll growth is different. So I just think we need to think about that. What would make sense for each of us?
This is also an analysis that may be really more timely the way to do solar evaluations are done, because it's going to change everything. So I don't think this is a particularly complicated analysis for them to do, but the timing of it might be something we want to think about.
That's a good consideration, I think. Thank you.
Agenda items for October 6th.
I have one for 9 o'clock, review the last meeting. Very creative.
And also go over what the actuary is, communication back and forth between us and the actuary, to know what to know as a group where we are.
Yep. And then at 11 o'clock, you're gonna.
Okay, yep, I'll confirm that with sense, Chris.
I guess right after lunch, it would probably be a good idea to spend some time with the draft, which I think, given that we're not meeting next week, hopefully you and David can work on updating it with as much as you think you can get in there in terms of glossary and table of contents and all of that. And if everyone can agree to take a peek at that before we get back here on October 6th, then at 1 in the afternoon, we can start reviewing that.
John, will we have some legal analysis back by then, possibly?
They're preliminary report to the member of October.
Or
So
October,
that's
so-
when we.
something. I don't know if it will be, I don't know if it will be October 6th or not, but we might just want to, just
Yeah,
in case.
I mean, they'll give us basically an update on where the law is today.
Mhm.
With respect to, most, all of the benefit changes we propose. I think what the final report can do is look closely at what we're actually proposing.
Okay, just wanted to make
And,
sure.
based on our call, we cannot tell them what we're proposing. so-
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Can I say one thing that's back on the last, not about the agenda, but I had a comment that as it filtered through in my head. When you were talking about what you had done and I think it was your group, and you were talking about the extra contributions and wondering if it could go directly to the unfunded liability. That's something that, when you talked about that, I had forgotten that when the liability goes up on one side, it goes down on the other. And I am wondering if we can run our numbers that way as well. Does that make sense, what I'm talking about? The increased employee contributions, whether all of that increase can go into unfunded liability rather than reducing what the employer also pays into the system?
I understand your question.
I don't, it sounded like there was maybe a,
I have to think about this statement, because what happens is normally when you increase contributions, it reduces normal cost on the employer side, right? And there's
Right.
also an amortization payment that needs to be made that's separate. So I think the idea here was to not change any of the payments on the employer side and just quantify what the estimated contributions would be and then apply that amount separately. So we've not done that before. We can ask actuaries if that's something that they can do. And that's a caveat with all of these things, right? We still have to ask them if this is something that's reasonable for them to model. Is that what you're talking about?
yeah, because when we were talking about increasing potential of increasing employee contributions, I personally would like that to all go to unfunded liability. So we're reducing that issue as soon as possible, and that those extra contributions are going to that purpose. Directly to that purpose.
So that presumably, based on that revenue memo, that would hopefully pay off the liability at an earlier date.
Exactly, exactly.
And that also then results in some lower ADEC payments in the future, correct? As that unfunded liability decreases.
Yeah, there'll be some slight, changes because of.
It might get us where we want to go faster. Because of the interest, and so I was wondering, because we had created our scenarios without having had that brilliant thought. I don't know who to attribute that brilliant thought to, but, and I just am learning from you all and thinking, ooh, that would be helpful to apply to our scenarios as well.
So I might be wrong here, but isn't one of the reasons we have an unfunded liability because we haven't been appropriately funding the normal costs over the past? I mean, it isn't just,
I would characterize it slightly differently. I would say when we do our experience studies every 4 years, we say that the experience that we thought was going to happen
Right.
is different than what actually happened.
right,
And so it's because of that, right, we've had some actuarial losses during the years.
yeah,
And so maybe we make the decision to change assumptions, which is what happened. So I also say that, if we did what you presumed of pulling outside to pay it off earlier, that's an option, but obviously that wouldn't eat into any of the targets that the committee was talking about for reductions in the liability.
Huh.
Well, it would be reduction in liability, we're going up reduction in ADA, right?
I don't think medical is.
Wouldn't it, it would be different if you held it in reserve, but if you apply it to the unfunded liability, wouldn't that affect the amortization payment?
It would, yeah, so when I was explaining, I was saying hold the amortization schedule the way it is. So that wouldn't affect the amortization due just paid off earlier. It's like the revenue.
Yeah, holding it all
Where
to
you
the
hold it
back.
all to the side and then you pay it off. earlier.
Our group had a bit of discussion over this as well, but we didn't necessarily come up with a structure to accomplish this.
So Andrew, and then I'm aware that it's a little after 4 and not knowing what people's schedules are.
I wonder, Molly, maybe if we just leave the scenario as it is now and see what happens with Dan and John's piece. And, just to see if is worthy of further discussion there. 'Cause I think it is a really interesting idea, but maybe let's stick where we decided earlier and then we can always revisit.
Yeah, I didn't know if it mattered in terms of going to the actuaries. Just when we started talking about the report, including potentially the scenarios we were talking about today, that made those scenarios feel a little more like, oh, wait, is this what we're going for? I thought those were just possible to look at. So I'm just aware of that and wanting to get closer to what I actually need.
Agenda items for next time.
Sarah, you had mentioned during the Act 75 that looking again at the future ADEC limit to inflation. Is that when we would do it the next meeting? You said you wanted to bring that back to discussion. I've just written it down. It
I have
was,
to remind
it
myself.
was part C on page 21 of the law.
Right, so we've been talking mainly about strategies to lower the ADEC, but I didn't feel like I fully understood whether anything that we're considering right now would slow the rate of growth of the ADEC. That's what I missed. It's that, asking the question of do we need to step back and take a fresh look at the concept of how to use, because it's one thing to lower the ADEC like this, but if the rate of growth is still increasing, then we're going to be back to where we were.
I just wondered if you wanted to
So-
put that on the agenda.
I guess that's an open question because I don't feel like I have a sense of what items might be put in that part of the agenda other than to ask the question.
Okay. To give us the info. you mean?
Right,
Yeah.
because we can lower the ADEC, but it's better if we can also slow the rate of growth of the ADEC, and I'm just not sure that we're there. And if anyone has ideas on that, would thoughts or observations on that?
Well, looking at the 2 versus 3% would address it for the amortization component of the ADEC.
There's a recommendation to take a layered approach in the future. That could be a path forward to further bending down that annual cost curve on the ADEC. And again, as Robert said, it's really hard to model that because we don't know what's going to happen in the future. But that is a tool in the toolbox that can be recommended as a strategy to try to contain it. Because we see a really crazy market thing happen. A couple of years out in 2038, you're going to see that ADEC cost spike very high. And I don't think the statute or Act 75 rather define the word inflation. So I think there's a lot of latitude in how you interpret that word. So some food for thought.
Sound good? All right, thank you all. This has been a very productive day.
Yeah, I think so.